Well, thank you everybody for coming to our session around friction-free authentication for TV Everywhere. My name is Vito Forlenza, Senior Director of TV Everywhere Content and Product Strategy at Comcast, and I have our esteemed panel here. We just want to set it up. These guys will introduce themselves and then we'll get started. So OTT and TV Everywhere have been a hot discussion topics at this conference so far. Some of the panels I attended yesterday were talking about TV Everywhere and OTT and how they coexist. And some people were talking about TV Everywhere, and one panel yesterday was called "The Business Strategy Behind the Fragmenting OTT Market." There's a comment that said it's too hard to sign in for TV Everywhere, and that's why the person who made that comment said they don't use it that much. But in Jonathan Hurd's talk, and Jonathan is from the Altman Volandrian company, he said that once millennials start using TV Everywhere, they become heavy users. And he said his research showed that 55% of millennials said they would use TV Everywhere once a month if they knew it existed. So the Open Authentication Technology Committee seeks to address these challenges. And in case you're unfamiliar with the OATC, it's a nonprofit industry association comprised of MVPDs, programmers, and technology companies. Its mission is to develop standards and identify best practices for the implementation of a simplified authentication system for online TV content. OATC has two overarching committees. One is a technical committee, and one is a TV Everywhere usability committee, and that's the committee that myself and the rest of our panel is on. So with me today to discuss some of the topics around TV Everywhere and friction-free authentication are James Hutchins from Synacor, Kimberly Hicks from Viacom, Brian Brinkman from Turner, and Jorge Glatanow from Adobe. So before we get started, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive in.
Hi, I'm Jorge Glatanow. I'm product manager for Adobe Primetime. So Adobe Primetime is a TV Everywhere platform, really helps programmers and MVPDs bring really good online TV experiences to market. The product that I'm specifically working on, and that's relevant for this panel today, is it's called Primetime Authentication. It used to be called Adobe Pass for TV Everywhere. So we've been at the kind of forefront of TV Everywhere since, like 2011 when we launched. I think CNN was on our first launches. And what we do is basically we help programmers interface with the MVPDs to exchange, authentication, authorization data. So they can basically say, yep, this user is good to go. They can access, they can watch this content. And we've come a long way. We're powering right now about 100 of the live linear channels. They power their TV Everywhere experiences. So it's good to see a lot of progress there. OATC for us has been really, really important because the problems we're trying to solve it takes an industry to solve them. Like it's the fragmentation, everyone has a slightly different opinion about how things should be done. And with OATC, it really comes together. It's like, no, this is the commonly agreed approach of doing things. So OATC has really been important for our product and kind of defining the roadmap of what we want to do.
Thank you, Jorge. Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Brinkman with Turner. I've been involved with TV Everywhere since the early days, maybe 2010. At that time, it was a lot of proof of concept setups, and we partnered with early adopters of this technology and capability and stood up some of the first systems to allow the system to prove itself out. And I think encouraged by the results there, we invested heavily in this, and it's a strategic part of our business. Currently, I'm involved still with the distributor relationships and working through all of the technical issues around TV Everywhere, as well as trying to advance the capabilities and the feature set. I think also OATC is this critical part of our business, and our involvement in it is important, primarily because as a programmer, we can't really always affect some of the more important technologies that need to enable the system and allow it to be more accessible by users. And so through OATC, we're able to write specifications and user requirements and stories that can help guide the industry and ultimately result in the kinds of experiences that we're all after with that.
Thank you, Brian. Kim?
I'm Kimberly Hicks. I'm VP of Product for User Experience at Viacom Media Networks. I actually started working in TV back with Brian at Turner Broadcasting in about 2010. taking them through the launch of their first products, and then went to Viacom as the TV Everywhere expert. Now I focus on TV Everywhere plus identity, personalization, search and recommendations. So my world really has that full ecosystem of how we can get people engaged in our products and keep them in our products. So I think it's a good path forward to looking at how to increase that usability. I'm also working on the OATC for user experience as well as CTAM, which is kind of the marketing side of the industry.
Thank you, Kim and James.
Hi, I'm James Hutchins. I'm with Cinecore, Product Manager for Cloud ID Services. Cinecore is a white label provider of start experiences, watch, cloud identity services, and email. My involvement with TV Everywhere started back in 2009, 2010 for the Olympic Games, and it went from there, integrating more and more MVPDs. We basically try to standardize the MVPDs out to the programmers or to Adobe, depending upon how they've done their integration, and offer an advanced feature set for authentication and authorization.
Thank you. So we're going to break the discussion down today into 3 themes. One is the importance of TV everywhere in the pay TV industry, raising awareness of TV everywhere, get those millennials watching, and creating a friction-free authentication experience. So I'll just open up to the panel by saying, why is TV everywhere important? Why have your various companies put such an effort behind it? And why are we working together with an industry group to standardize TV everywhere?
I can jump in. So when TV Everywhere started, it was the Time Warner CEO got with Comcast CEO Brian Roberts and said, we have to look at a way to save our industry because we're losing eyes, we're losing people, and people do not see the value in their subscription, especially when the world of programmers is putting their content on the web for free. So we've licensed this content, we have distribution deals. Some of the distributors couldn't put long-form content on the web because of those rights and the distribution deals they had in place. So this was a way to value those customers and really look at them as a VIP. You're paying for the subscription to have in your home, so let's continue to position you as a valued customer and drive you to that content that you're paying to see. So I think HBO is a great example of that, where it's a premium service and people expect to have that access that someone else doesn't because you're paying for it. And it's the same thing across the board for cable. So we really wanted to drive that as a way to value those customers, but we have a long ways to go, I think, to make it frictionless.
Anyone else want to?
I would concur that for subscribers to realize the value of the content that they've already paid for, the expectation has been there and is growing that they should be able to get that content anywhere. And there are other services that compete with just traditional linear content that also reinforce that expectation. So I think TV Everywhere becomes that model by which we collectively provide that service.
TV Everywhere, as you may know over the years, has kind of been a little maligned in the, I would say, in the news industry by the way it's been perceived. In the beginning, it was very difficult to sign in, and I think over the years, we've made great strides in allowing people to sign in. But could we talk about some of the challenges for TV Everywhere adoption and sign-in that we're seeing and what we're doing to try to overcome them?
I can take that. So you're right, a lot of the press has been around, it's hard to sign in and it's hard to, understand what's going on. And I think at the bottom of it, I think the users are right. The model itself is a complicated one to understand at a first glance. Like, you're on the CNN site and you have to sign in with Comcast. Like that's something that for us, it's pretty basic, it's pretty normal, but we're talking about hundreds of millions of users doing that. It's hard for them to understand the model. So I think that's been one of the challenges, understanding what you're supposed to be doing, and is it in-home, is it outside the home, is it free, is it included in your package? So I think we've come a long way in clarifying some of these issues, and I think OATC with the, we have some user experience recommendations, CTAM, that Kim referenced earlier also has some user experience recommendations. Things like, hey, it's included in your package. Like make sure the users understand what they're supposed to be doing. Other than that, the sign-in is a sign-in, right? So yeah, you need to create an account, but it's not different from what you need to do to access Facebook, right? So I think that the problem is a bit on the side of understanding what you get access to once you do sign in, so understanding the benefits that you get by using TV Everywhere. And I think that's where we kind of struggle and what we need to improve, because there's the amount of value that's out there, that we see out there with the hundreds of apps and sites, and the experiences they provide is fantastic. But in order to get that, we need to make the users understand that, what's available.
I would say even beyond that, once you understand that there is this content available out there and this model that I have to get the content from one place but identify myself with the other, there are real practical challenges around knowing that I even have an account, setting up the password. I mean, I have an email account that I know I need to log into to be able to get my email, but I didn't even know that I had an account to be able to access the TV Everywhere software,
right,
nor how to go about setting it up if I needed to. And then once I go past that, I need to remember that particular password that I only use for this limited context to be able to consume the content. So there's, I think, even beyond that, knowing what it is and how it works, just remembering what the tools are to be able to access it can be problematic.
Right.
James, what are some of the things Synacor and then maybe the industry as a whole has done to try to make it easier for users to sign in or remember passwords, or just make it a little bit more second nature to know how to sign in? Because nobody complains about signing into Netflix. They complain about signing into TV Everywhere.
Right. So the first big push we've had recently is home-based authentication, or more properly, it's not really home, it's network-based, based upon the user's IP or some type of identifier that can be passed through the network will determine the account number of the user and allow that account into the system, not necessarily the user. In addition to that, there are other things that can be done that we'll probably be talking about at OATC over the next year, involving long-lived device registration. Once that device has been bound to the user, we'll be able to identify the user on their return visits without them having to sign back in again. And simpler sign-in methods. Today, the big challenge is your account, which may be your email account or a separate system, but you may not remember your password. When you initially got cable, you got your account, you were like, what am I going to do with this thing? I never use it. 3 years later, you go, I want to watch TV Everywhere. We're expecting you to pull out a credential or figure out how to reset it. That flow's not always apparent. But if you look at like what Yahoo's doing with general identity, they now have passwordless sign-in. It's not really passwordless. They send you a one-time code on a phone, and you'll enter that instead of your traditional password. Anything that can prove who the user is the barrier.
I think about the early days of TV Everywhere. You were mentioning the Olympics in 2010, and it was a pretty convoluted process to sign in. And now, so it was for us at Comcast, it was your username and password, and now it's your username and password. It's the home-based authentication. It's Facebook Connect. It's an easier way to recover your credentials. But what are some of the things that you've seen over the years that you've done, your groups have done specifically to try to work with either the MVPDs or educate your users on what you need to do in order to get in and watch and consume TV Everywhere?
So I'll take one.
Go ahead.
So Turner produces March Madness yearly, and it's a big tentpole event, a lot of attention around that, and I think that we've tried to leverage awareness around that event to also drive awareness around the availability of the content through the TVE mechanism, as well as the mechanics necessary to be able to log it in. So there's a value proposition that's delivered through the distributors because they have the subscribers, right? And so a mass mailing goes out that lets them know about the event, where they'll be able to consume the event, the types of devices. It prepares them to get their username and password or whatever they need to be able to log into the system, and maybe even encourage them through some sort of promotion to do that early, right? And so it sort of primes the pump for the upcoming event, and in the process, I think, raises the general awareness about TV Everywhere and how to use it.
And I think the live events are great because it gets people over that hurdle when it's a must-see TV situation. and then they realize, oh, okay, now I know my credentials because I went through it because I had to watch this, and they can continue coming back. So one of the things we look at as well is as simple as what is our wording when you get to a point where you have to pick your distributor. How are we presenting that to that person? So where it doesn't seem like a burden or that it's confusing. Keeping your demographic in mind. If it's an older audience, maybe a simple infographic. If it's kids, make sure that they know to get their parents. Some kids know their credentials, I think, probably more so than their parents. But just make sure we know that audience and that we're continuing to refine that. I think as people use TV Everywhere more and more, how we pitch it and how we phrase things differs. So, 3 years ago, it was completely new, whereas now it's more and more common. And the key is to have that be a consistent experience across any programmer. So I wouldn't want someone to come to Comedy Central and then go to TBS and see something completely different and feel disrupted by it. So that consistency and that experience is really important, and continuing to refine it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about talking to the customers. At Comcast, we took the CTAM recommendations and we created a new login page. And the page just has a different UX, but nothing structurally changed. And just by talking to the users in a little bit more of a friendly way, we've increased authentication success by 10%, not 10 percentage points, but by 10%. So, Jorge, could you talk a little bit about how OATC and CTAM are working together to share best practices and work with the different people in the industry?
Sure, absolutely. We're working very closely together. OATC is more on the technical side. I think that's how we started. And we try to, provide like standards and best practices and how they're supposed to do things. We do have a user experience committee, and I think that's where we work closest with CTAM. CTAM is more on the marketing side, so they think about how do we increase awareness of TV Everywhere, right? With campaigns, this is the messaging that you should be using, but user experience as well. So that's kind of the overlap between OATC and CTAM. But I think each of us, we make sure that each of us has a good charter, we're both trying to push things forward, but CTAM more from the marketing side and OATC more from the technical side of things, I would say. But we enjoy the collaboration we have with them, and we are referencing their user experience recommendations, our document, and vice versa. I think they're doing a good job.
The raising awareness is another theme that we have for this panel, so we can move into that a little bit more deeply. I think, Brian, you mentioned some of these big events are these keys to communicating to users that you can watch. When I mentioned in the open about millennials saying they don't really know TV Everywhere exists, other research that we've seen from actually Hub Entertainment shows if you say TV Everywhere, maybe around 25% people know what it is. But if you say, well, it's the ability to log in with your credentials and watch on a computer or laptop, then it goes up to more like the 50%. So can we talk about how we're using stunts like March Madness to reinforce the notion of TV Everywhere and what you get as part of your package?
Sure. I addressed it a little bit with the previous question. I think it's just that emphasis on the value of being able to get the content from any location. It's on any device, so that's always an important part of the delivery of this if you're not at home. I think the other emphasis in those communications to try to raise awareness is the additional value that you get from consuming content through a TV Everywhere experience as opposed to purely through your TV set. Obviously, as an application, I can deliver a bonus feature set. I can provide recommendations, I can provide fan feedback, and I can provide things like brackets and bracket challenges. So there's just a deeper experience, and a lot of that gets communicated through those awareness pieces as well. So that's...
I would add that we're seeing, like you referenced the London 2012 Olympics, right? That's, I think, when we saw the first big jump for TV Everywhere. And sport has really driven a lot of traffic for TV Everywhere. It's kind of like the ideal partner, right? It's something that you have to log in to watch. It's live, and you want to get it now. The content is very, very compelling. But the interesting thing we're seeing is that once users get in after these big events like World Cup, Sochi Olympics, March Madness, they tend to stick around. So all of a sudden, it's like, well, now I've made the effort of getting these credentials. I know how to log in. What else is available to me? And they're realizing that, well, there's this whole bunch of experiences that are just amazing. Like I always like to reference the CNN Go application. Like the evolution of that product for me has been very interesting to see. Like now you can, leave the video playing in a thumbnail and scroll to news and jump in the timeline. And like that's not something you can do on a TV. That's a completely different way of consuming television than it's been possible before. But back to my original point, like I think they have these sports events that drive a lot of that, but then they discover these other experiences that are like, wow, this is very compelling, and they stick around. So that's kind of been the driver, really.
Thanks for the CNN bump.
Do you think some of the challenges for TV Everywhere over the years have been that there's all these different systems, whereas if you go to something like an SVOD, it's the same all the time, but if you go to all these different either programmers, MVPDs, the content differs and the experience differs. Do you think that's been one of the biggest hurdles that we've been trying to overcome?
Yes, definitely, and it's at Viacom we have content on Hulu, we have content on Amazon, we've had content on Netflix, so it's difficult for people to discover and where their content is, and if they want to binge watch a series, how do I find it? So that's something we're working on. A lot of those deals have been around a while, so how the business models have worked in the past and how they're going to work in the future, I think, are going to be very different. But that's increasing that discoverability too of how do I find a series, how do I catch up on it, and where is it? I think people expect it to be all in one spot. So then there's a lot of consumer frustration there when it is in multiple places. We're our best users too. I've experienced it. Like where's Homeland right now? But now it's all on the Showtime app. But it can be frustrating to find that, and it's really driven by our business models and how we create our revenue and keep that.
So yeah, the business models were you going to add something?
No, I completely agree with Kim. I think we talked about awareness and how users are not aware that with their pay TV subscription, you have all this TV everywhere that comes with it and what you can access. But Kim's point was around fragmentation, which is a pretty big problem as well. Like even if I know that I have access to this, where exactly do I go? And it was pretty interesting to see the evolution of all these sites and apps appearing, and they're continuing to grow, like Apple TV, Roku, Xbox. We've seen a tremendous growth in that area, so it's not stopping. But at the same time, how do you deal with the fragmentation? How do you deal with having to install 100 apps on your iPhone? It's not going to happen. Like we need to provide a simpler way of users to find that content. And again, I think that's where OATC comes in, because it's an industry problem that needs to be solved at an industry level. And hopefully that's something OATC will take on next year and start figuring out what are the first steps you can make in this direction.
Yeah, I would just add technically it's night and day compared to delivering the same. If you think about TV Everywhere as a product or something that you might get through Netflix or a platform like Apple TV, building something like that is in a monolithic system is much easier than trying to coordinate the efforts of hundreds of companies to meet a certain specification and an experience. And I think, again, that goes back to what maybe one of the prime reasons for OATC is to create these standards and this interoperability, and then the user experience group on top of that to try to create more of a uniform product feel to what is otherwise delivered across a large number of companies. So it's the fundamental problem of it.
Open to the panel, could you guys talk a little bit about what OATC has done to try, up to this point, to try to basically standardize TV Everywhere or provide guidelines around fragmentation, anything along those lines to make it easier to use?
So we have...
We can all take it.
There's tons, right?
Anyone take it.
Technical efforts, and the technical efforts and usability efforts, I think. I'll just touch on a couple of technical efforts and we can open it up. There's, as part of TV Everywhere, there are multiple flows and components to make this thing go. The identifying yourself, making sure that you have a subscription between a content site and the distributor where you've actually obtained your subscription. So there have been lots of specifications written that allow for that interoperability. I'd say more recently, recognizing the real challenges around credential-based authentication, this notion of home-based or network-based identification has really risen and has proved very successful to raise the authentication rate, I would say on average 20% across all of the distributors who are taking advantage of that. So seeing the value of that, OATC really threw themselves into defining use cases and specifications that allow for the work to primarily happen at the distributor level or the providers like Synacor. But that's the type of thing that OATC has done.
Yes, to add to that, for the early adapters of HBA this year, we've seen 20% increase in engagement of TV Everywhere, which is pretty good, but we've seen a 50% reduction in conversion, meaning users who would come in, try to sign in repeatedly, and then just give up. So, you know, I mean, we've had people, we have MVPDs that we work with that have a 50% failure rate, basically. You know, half the people that go there don't get in. Now, that doesn't mean they're legitimate subscribers. Maybe they're trying to get in. But with HBA, those same companies have risen to like a 5 to 10% failure rate for every day, which is amazing. So that tells me there probably are subscribers trying to get in.
I think one of the key things to point out is that fundamentally early in the days, the OATC was built to have, we had companies like Turner and Comcast and Synacor and Adobe really investing in it, but you have a lot of smaller programmers, a lot of smaller distributors that don't have the engineering resources to do something like this. So in order for it to be a success, we had to standardize and basically give everybody the tools to do this and to make it happen. So doing things like the metadata spec we started with early, the basic protocol around authentication, really, I think, helped drive that as examples across the industry of here's all the tools you need to implement and launch this. And then having partners like Synacor who can help those smaller distributors who just don't have those resources and help get them going has been really key to get it moving in the industry.
You know, one of the things along those lines was moving on to our third theme of home-based authentication and reducing friction for the process. We published a spec recently about home-based authentication usability guidelines and how MVPDs and programmers, when they're implementing home-based authentication, some of the best practices they could utilize in order to have an experience that when you start on one property and go to another property and another property, it all feels the same and is consistent. So open to the panel, you know, please talk a little bit about the process of that spec and maybe highlight a point or two in that specification that we're using to try to standardize home-based authentication for the industry.
I can take that. So with home-based authentication, you start off with a very simple technical challenge, like the user is on the network and it's hitting the login screen with a particular IP. That IP is known to you, and you know there's a modem at that IP, so you can quickly say, I know who this is, let them in, they don't need to log in, right? So that's a technical challenge, and that's actually, well, that's complicated too, but that's the easiest part in a way, because actually you have a lot of things that are built on top of that. First of all, you need to, and this is where the user experience guidelines that you mentioned, Vito, really comes into play, because the users need to understand what's going on. Like they need to, if it just works, and like it works at home and then you're at Starbucks, it doesn't work anymore, you're gonna get frustrated. Like the users need to understand what's happening. They need to be messaged. They need to be able to, for example, if they do care about parental controls, they need to be able to go in and set that up. They need to, they need to be notified and messaged appropriately. And that should be done in a standard way so that you don't jump from site to site and you get different messages and different, like you start to be conflicted around how is this exactly supposed to work. So I think that's the value of the user experience recommendation, that tries to standardize so that it's a unified experience for the user, and you don't have to put them in a mode where they have to learn and understand what's going on. They should already have a clear understanding of that. And because at the end of the day, they want to watch content, right? They want to be entertained. They're not here to solve things for work. They just want to breeze through that process, and that's what we're trying to do. Like make sure they understand what they're doing and just watch content as soon as possible, like don't stand in their way.
I'd say from a user experience perspective, to build on what you said, it's tough because you want them to know what just happened, and you want them to know when they're out of the home why it's different. But the goal of it is to have it be as frictionless as possible. So, we we had many rounds where we had like, that's too much messaging, now it's not enough messaging, and then when it's kids, it's a whole other story. So I think we have a good standard now, but it's, again, we're going to have to continue to refine it as people use it and they get to know what's happening a little bit more and how do we message that to them and have a comfort level so it's not weird of like, wait, what happened? Why is this locked sometimes and not locked? So it's a tough balance to find, but I think not requiring credentials is the key to get things moving forward.
And I would just add one thing on top of what Kim said around you were discussing earlier before the panel that around user testing and how important that is. And you put that something in front of users and you realize just how important these kind of things are. Like if you just think they're not important, you're absolutely wrong. Like just the messaging that you mentioned, the fact that the way that the message is presented there, just that matters a lot. Like even more than the technical specification at some point. Just how the whole experience is crafted to make their users understand and feel safe in what they're doing is very important.
Yeah, and I would just say, for me, it's analogous to the usability guidelines that probably Apple started back in the Mac days, this consistent way that an application should behave so that I, as a user, can start up another app and I know exactly how to interact with it. In this case, it's the distributors that are delivering an application experience per se. And that consistent experience allows them to navigate it comfortably and confidently.
With home-based authentication does present some challenges. So I think Jorge mentioned a little bit about parental controls, but we can talk a little bit more about that. So if you're automatically authenticating a user, how could you be sure that maybe restricted content or maybe mature content isn't being seen by someone who maybe shouldn't get it? Like by a 4-year-old, you don't want them watching something with violence or things like that. Perhaps. But so what could be done in that area to ensure that users are able to basically enjoy the benefit of home-based authentication but not almost be harmed by it?
Right. I think not a lot of users care about parental controls, right? But there are a subset of users who really care about them. So back to what Kim was saying, you don't want to stand in, like 95% of users don't care about that. So you shouldn't like really be in their way to watch content. But for the rest of them, the key is really to make sure they see that information when they need it, that they have a way to stop the flow and say, no, I want to go in and set parental controls here. I want to do, make sure I'm in control of what's happening here. At the same time, you want to have it, make it a good user experience. Like if you want to override with a pin or something else, that you give them the option to do that. And again, messaging, it should be super clear for them why you're stopped to watch this show, because you've set up parental controls, and here's where you go to set them. What are the actions available to you to go and do that? And I would use parental controls as just a way to enforce the value of OATC. We started working on a specification for parental controls for TV Everywhere, and I honestly said like, okay, this is going to be one pager, and we're going to be done in like a couple of weeks, and it's going to be done. And then we started discussing, and we realized like, wow, this is like there's so many use cases, and you have the Turner perspective, Viacom perspective, the Cinecor perspective, all kind of poured into this document. And I see HBO is in the audience as well. They provide like fantastic feedback recently on that document as well. But it takes that sort of industry effort to come up with a solution that we think it's going to work. If we're just, each of us would develop their own, they would look completely different. By having those discussions, now we come on something that's stamped, and that this is the way we should be doing it, and this is actually how we can provide a good user experience with that.
And I know for the programmers, Brian and Kim, I think what you also have to deal with is you have somebody like a Comcast who has a full-featured parental control solution, and then some maybe smaller MVPDs who have very small parental control capabilities. So how do you address that? How, like working with a programmer, or I'm sorry, a distributor who has a lot of capabilities, maybe a smaller distributor that doesn't have as robust of a solution?
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the complication that Jorge was talking about. Not only do you have this plethora of use cases, but you have this combination of capability to support and need to enforce that adds additional challenge on top of that. I guess I would take a step back and say, one of our guidelines or one of our reference points has been regular, standard, linear TV, that the experience should be no more complicated than that. Ideally, I should be able to go to a site, and there should be nothing between me and clicking on a video and being able to watch that, right? And it's just these additional constraints that may have been set up. If I'm a household that has parental controls, well, then on linear TV, I'm also getting an interstitial or some sort of a block that forces me to enter in a PIN or things like that. So I think that's been a guide in terms of when we do try to step forward and when there's a need for interaction with the user. I think for the use cases where distributors can't support parental controls or don't have them or don't care about them, to this point, I think it's fallen kind of neatly in the category that they are analogous to the household that hasn't set up parental controls. So, I think we want to be able to recognize when a user is from a household that has parental controls and make sure that we only provide content that meets the rating restrictions for that individual. And then for those that don't, or those that don't have that capability, then obviously we don't have to take any additional steps.
And I think for us as well, it's like we want HBA out, home-based authentication out as quickly as possible. But there's, and James will probably build on this, but there's limitations with the capabilities that a distributor has. So we've got to encourage them to shift their focus from whatever priorities they have to focus on home-based authentication and really drive why there's that business value to them when they may have infrastructure changes or something else planned, more distributors to onboard. So it's just that kind of the trade-off of, what is a priority for them to do to get this available for us.
In addition to parental controls, as pointed out here, you can set, of course, on the household level, and we've talked about PIN support. The industry has to add that, but in addition to that, some applications are rich based upon the end user, so that's been the newest challenge is at certain points in the application, they now need to exit HBA and become the user, or a user.
Personalization.
And correct, for personalization purposes. And the technical committee has a recommendation that'll be coming out here soon on how we're going to do that to send the user back and say, become a user at this point.
So in addition to home-based authentication, what other things could we as an industry be doing to help users sign in? It's kind of a little, strikes me a little bit sometimes when we're talking about TV everywhere. It's the ability to watch this content on your phone, tablet, wherever you are. But we see a lot of usage in the home, and we focus on a home-based authentication. But what other things are available? I know, James, you mentioned things like SMS and social. But what could we be doing, and how could we be implementing those as well to give the user a lot of different choices on how they want to sign in?
Right, those technologies, usually it just comes down to binding, in the case of like social, the users use Facebook or Google or Twitter. So they'll bind that credential to their MVPD credential. So basically when they come back, they're telling the MVPD, here's my social ID, and they can use that to retrieve their MVPD account and say, sure, go ahead and go in. I know who you are. And most authentication technologies are variations of that. It's a binding of something unique, either about the device or another external entity that the user always has present. I would say the bigger challenge is, where we haven't really worked yet, is the discovery. Before that, right? The MVPD discovery, which identity provider. So hopefully this next year we can work on, because once you get the user there, you can make a passive type request so the user doesn't even know that it's happening. But you have to get them to that point where you're sending them over.
Sure. Brian, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, the ideal is never having to log in. I think the goal for TV Everywhere is to almost make it fade into the background as though it doesn't exist, right? You'd like to use there to be as little as possible between the user and the consumption of content, just like they would on their TV. And so, as you point out in the home, that's there are ways to do that, and we'll be capitalizing on those, and we already have been. Excuse me. Outside the home, I think that there's opportunity as well, and the one that comes to mind for me is extending the authentication trust, the TTL, right? As I log in on a device, or if I log in on a console, one of the challenges around TV Everywhere is the trust of that particular identity over an extended period of time. I could give the phone away, I could leave a PC logged in at the library, and people could access my account there. So there's sort of counterbalances there that need to be addressed that allow us to trust those authentications for an extended period of time. And I think that's one of the comparisons, and you may have referenced it at the beginning. Netflix, for example. I log in once for Netflix, and I don't ever have to log in again, practically speaking. And one of the reasons for that, at least the convenience for Netflix, is that, again, they own the whole monolithic stack and manage everything, and so they can know if you've logged in too many times in too many places or things like that. So they have that counterbalanced trust where, as long as you haven't exceeded those kinds of thresholds, they can leave you in for a real long time. And by doing that, that is obviously the better user experience. I don't ever have to enter credentials, and therefore my content is only a click away.
You know, sometimes when somebody asks me, oh, you know, TV Everywhere, hasn't gotten off the ground, I kind of take them on a timeline of 2010 was the Vancouver, and then as Jorge, you mentioned, watershed moment, I would say for TV Everywhere was the London Olympics.
Yeah.
And then going forward, all the live streaming that came off of that, and you had CNN and Viacom. So could you, Jorge, I'm going to ask you if you could share some of the usage trends we've seen in the industry, and then for the rest of the panelists, if you could talk a little bit about the successes that you've seen on your own properties as well through the years on TV Everywhere.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So Adobe publishes this Adobe Digital Index report that really looks at the data that we have, and it tries to do exactly that. So I'm going to, reference them for those numbers. We're really seeing, like going back to 2011, basically, we're seeing, a few apps. iOS mostly was the platform of choice. There was a lot of consumption on iOS, not much for the rest. Fast forward a few years, and you're seeing, more than 300 apps and sites out there on all these platforms. iOS is still the dominant platform we're seeing in the industry, but it's no longer the only one. And you have, Android. You still have desktop consumption, and more recently, we've seen this what we call the OTT devices like Apple TV, Roku, Fire TV, Xbox, really starting to take huge chunks of the consumption, and users are very engaged on those platforms. Once you start watching on the big screen and you see the experience, then you're just going to consume more and more. So we've seen this move from iOS and just a few apps to just this tremendous explosion of sites and apps, and we're seeing double-digit growth, triple-digit growth for this year as well. Like it's been like that year over year, but even this year, even though you didn't have an Olympics, as I said, like people tend to come for big sporting events and stick around, so that kind of naturally pushes consumption up. This year, it's March Madness, which is a yearly event, but it's not been any major live sporting events, but still, we're seeing the same growth kind of continuing to be there. The only, we also publish a figure of the penetration of TV Everywhere as you see it from our perspective, and I think we're about 13% penetration. Like if you look at the total households that could have access to that, we're about 13% on a quarterly basis. So, and those users, what we're seeing, that those users are consuming more and more. So once you get in, you start to consume. But we're also seeing that across the industry, like the potential is much higher. So that's why the work at OATC is so critical, because there's so much value. These users already have this in their package. You don't even need to buy it. How do we make this transition so that this gets used by more and more people than it is today? That's why OATC missions is critical in getting to this friction-free experience. I think is going to be critical to get those numbers up even more than they are today.
I would echo the point of, from a Turner perspective, of seeing the availability of our applications spread across a great number of devices. Of course, all of our networks. We're not on all of those devices, but clearly the trend is there. We've seen that, and we're building towards those as well. Really just providing the TV Everywhere content where subscribers are consuming it. And I think you'll continue to see that from us, especially with our premier products like March Madness, which will be coming out again. We've seen the same type of growth year over year in terms of that TV Everywhere consumption. So just within the more, you've got a broader view, but within the more narrow Turner perspective, we see some very high line numbers. I think it was 2 years ago we hit 1 million concurrent users on March Madness. So the traffic is there. People are coming to watch it. Right now it's as you say, a segment, 13%, but ever growing, and tends to be for more tentpole events, and then maybe with some long tail that follows that. I think that our goal is just to try to continue to grow that and spread that out a little bit more consistently.
I think we've seen the same thing. Our numbers have continually gone up with the authentication flow of people getting in. I think one of the biggest complaints we have at Viacom is we don't have all the major distributors yet. So we see that more of a complaint than the fact I have to log in. We're also launching international apps. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how well it's adopted in other countries. And really, that's where we're really looking at what the messaging is and how do we set that up for success, knowing what we know now. But we're just launching a product in Mexico, and we've got a product in Portugal with a lot more coming. So I'm hoping we see those same rates, but it's entirely different markets. So as we stretch out to that, just understanding what the desire is there and how do we position it for success in those countries.
James, you care to share any successes?
Sure. We've had a very steady growth in the premium, and then on the more of the subscription commercial, shorter form, non-movie. How do you term yourself? We see lots of spike growth, especially with sporting events or live events like the presidential debates that are extremely high.
So we have about 15 minutes left in the session. I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3 more questions and open it up. Questions from the audience. If you're thinking of some, you can just raise your hand when we get there. If you aren't thinking of some, now's a good time. So some of the final questions, I'll maybe start with you, Horia. What will you be watching some trends in 2016 as it pertains to TV everywhere?
Sure. So I think OATC has been really focused on making this sign-in process frictionless, right? And I think we're going to continue to focus on that. Going to continue the efforts we have around home-based authentication. We're probably going to start looking at this growing category of devices, the OTT devices, Apple TV, Roku, and so on. That right now you have to have a registration code, and you actually use your laptop or iPad to log in. So we'll be looking to how do we make that an easier process. But outside of the sign-in experience itself, I think we discussed today about awareness and content discovery, and I think OATC, from a technical perspective, next year we'll probably start looking into how do we make the first steps there, like how do we help the users find content. We have a metadata spec that it's been the first in that direction, but we probably need more as other as well as mechanisms for increasing awareness. What are the technical things we could do, like maybe a free preview window or something like that, to drive awareness to new levels. So it should be exciting work next year.
Brian, Kim, James, what are the types of things you'll be trying to keep your fingers on the pulse for in 2016?
Yeah, one more that comes to mind is better experience on mobile devices, interoperability. We talked about for each experience, and I think there's a reason to have multiple applications. Talked about the extended feature set of a CNN Go or March Madness with brackets. So I think there's a reason to have applications per network or at some level. But the interoperability between those has been a little bit stunted by privacy concerns by the device operating systems. And so I think enhancing those kinds of capabilities, where if I discover content on a particular app or a link to it or a recommendation from a friend in a tweet, that I'm able to quickly get to that content within the application on my phone without having to go through some extended process of authenticating and things like that. So that's another one I think we should focus on.
Very interesting.
I think two of the main things are kind of bridging that gap in the fragmented market of increasing discoverability so people know where the content is and how to get it, and also driving a personalized experience. So we want people to feel valued as a customer, but there's hundreds of video apps in the market that we're competing against. I mean, YouTube is a competitor for short form content. So how do we make our apps and sites be that much more compelling to you and make you feel like it is a personalized experience for you and driving that type of the content you want and the information you want to see towards you. and really make that an enhanced experience.
For Cinecore working with OATC, the big thing this next year will be just easing and increasing the capabilities of MVPDs across the board. Not everyone has equal systems, so it's just trying to bring a baseline up and bring those integrations up so users are having an easier time trying to sign in.
So let me ask one more question before we open up to questions from the audience. Brian, I'm going to start with you on this one. I know you and I have talked about this a lot, but what is your ultimate TV Everywhere experience, your ideal scenario?
I guess I look at TV Everywhere as, ideally it would be viewed by consumers as a product. That TV Everywhere would be analogous to a Netflix or a YouTube, that it would be a destination in a sense, and that I could access all of these rich applications through some sort of common gateway or through some simple mechanism. Or you mentioned the metadata spec, which is a way for us to drive the information about the availability of content into potentially third-party sites, maybe an aggregator, maybe a search engine like Google. But there would be some sort of a mechanism that I, as a user, could quickly go to it. I go to my channel guide, I go to my remote, and I'm able to find the content that I want, and that continues to get better. The X1 platform does a great job there.
Thank you.
Ideally, there would be the same type of capabilities within TV Everywhere. There's the rich apps are offered through all of the different programmers, and so there's no one place that you actually land to consume it, but there ought to be a sort of a single place to go and find where you need to go, and then of course all that smooth experience between that and the final destination.
Anybody else have thoughts on the ultimate nirvana for TV Everywhere?
I would love it when I explain to people what I do for a living, they don't moan and cringe. That I want them to feel like you're providing. I was at a conference once and people that were talking about they're saving lives and everything, and I'm like, I'm just creating a barrier for people. So I really want it to where it doesn't feel like a barrier, that it feels like, like I'm saving your life. But it feels like an improved experience, and that you are feeling valued, and not that it's a frustration or something like that. It's that you're like, wow, that's really cool that you do that, and not run away.
So anybody in the audience have any questions for our panel?
Hi, I'm Victor. One of the friction points that also, since the topic is friction-free TV Everywhere, is the case when you change of your MSO, your MVPD, you change from Comcast to AT&T or something like that. Right now, the relationship is essentially broken, and you need to start over again. Number one, and this is probably more for the content guys, is this a concern to you? And number two, what are some of the, are you doing some efforts in your organization to see how to address this problem?
Sure, and just to repeat it for anybody who may be watching online is the question about friction-free authentication and moving from maybe one MVPD to another. How do you maybe carry over so you don't have to start everything up again? And is that a concern for programmers?
I would say from a home-based authentication perspective, it should be seamless for you. But that's one of the usability things we look at. So if we remember your provider, and so just jump past you having to pick and bring up your provider, we always want to make sure there's a path back, and that that there's a path back and not get stuck. So there's that balance of helping you get in quickly because we know that you've logged in with this provider before, but also giving you that path and route that's obvious to you and you don't feel stuck to choose someone different. So it's just, and there's a lot of user testing we have to do around that too, continually of making sure people understand how to do that. Fortunately, people don't change providers too much, I don't think, but that doesn't mean you don't build for that edge case, right? I mean, you have to consider that, and that's it. Everything we do, it's like as we're building it, it looks very simple. Home-based authentication, great, let everyone in. Well, then you have kids, you have KidVid, COPA compliance. You've got apps you don't want someone to see, or things like that. So you've got to consider all these edge cases as well, and that's something we try to do very much through the OATC and CTAM, is to think about those and how to make that person able to get back in quickly and not feel cut off forever.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I better qualify that I work for aspect, commercial-free sort of around plays and all of this. Like, for a subscriber to Netflix, you know, and I personally want, I'm sure with the other 42 million of us, is there's that aspect of commercial-free that you get. It's uninterrupted. You get to sort of choose your programming. I guess with the services that you guys are trying to offer, like, is taking away the commercials, or I'm not sure if that's possible, but don't you think that commercials are often a barrier, especially for millennials,
So
in them adopting to TV everywhere platforms?
So the question was, could maybe a commercial-free experience enhance TV everywhere?
Yeah, essentially. Thanks for simplifying.
I would agree that, you know, I would say that it is sort of what you've purchased with a linear subscription period, right? When you're watching your TV, for the most part, you're watching commercials. You'll occasionally get content that's not commercial-based, and as a parallel, you should have access to that same type of content through the TV Everywhere experience as well, right? So I wouldn't say that TVE is necessarily the differentiator there as to whether commercials exist or not. Just to the point of whether reduced commercial load could drive TVE as an enhancement, as an enhanced offering, I think that's something that programmers are looking at. You know, I think that there's a balance to be struck there, obviously, right? Just between, you know, the profitability of that model and at the same time wanting to attract millennials and a broader audience to the content.
And I think it also brings up kind of a business model scenario of whether it needs to be modernized or not, but the success of our shows is based on the Nielsen rating. So you have air date plus 3 days, so C3 or C7, so air date plus 7 days, which is what the success of a show is based on, of how many people watched it, and that's where our ad sales go into for our broadcast side. And ad sales brings a lot of money. So there's that balance there of, you know, do I want to count that device? There's some devices we still can't count yet that we're trying to. So there's that balance of, you know, what is the value of that user, and does that make up for that ad revenue or not? Like I said, that's kind of the fundamental programmer business model we've had for decades, and that's something that we should look at as an industry of how do we change that.
We have time for one final question if anybody has one. No? Well, thank you for coming to our session. I hope this session shows that the industry is committed to TV everywhere, and programmers and technology companies and MVPDs are coming together to really improve the experience and make it the best it can be for our customers. Thanks so much.
Thank you.